Program number 498, June 21st, 1981. I can't believe the year is half over. It is. I guess it's time for contemplation. It's gone so fast, half a year. We've survived the Reagan administration for a half a year, and I have a lot of feelings about what has come down the last 6 months. It's also the nice longest day of the year, and the days get shorter towards winter. That's hard to believe, too. I was almost going to spend the evening just reading poetry with you or talking about Father's Day and the Ronald Reagan family. There's ordinary people, and then there's the extraordinary people. And I cracked up today when I read an article by Nancy Reagan about the Reagan family, and I may share a few thoughts with you about that. The year began with a preview. Ronald Reagan's a movie actor, you know. We got a preview in December when John Lennon was killed, a little taste of what was going to come down. As a matter of fact, on the radio program, December the 7th, 1980, Sunday night, I talked about the assassination teams. They're all together from the early 60s. Those were the early rock days when they were trying to deport John Lennon and Yoko. And I talked about the murder team would be ready to move and assassinate quickly soon again. And the next day, John Lennon was murdered. And as the story evolves, and there's a wall of silence around Chapman, the man who's been charged with the murder, I know more and more that this was a large conspiracy. I knew it immediately. And the next day after the program, I talked about this murderous team and mentioned the gang that did so many violences before they got some more power in Washington, D.C. The very next day, that shooting had taken place. And then, of course, Ronald Reagan waited a long time to become president, and he got his inauguration and oath of office, and within 3 months, he was shot. We predicted that again the evening before on radio program, that the shooting would begin inside the White House. And, of course, the wall of silence about John Hinckley Jr., the charges, and he isn't even visible. We haven't seen him since then. And then a couple months later, the Pope was shot, and he's suffering pain and complications at the present time. And they're putting off the trial of Mohammed Ajah, because they know that even if he were alone in St. Peter's, and they haven't really concluded that he was alone, he had assistance, and again, the interweaving links of the Hinckley gang and the Turkish Nazi group, the international group, and the same kind of people that were behind Chapman's shooting of Lennon has kept these people at a standstill. They began very strong when the administration began. We heard a lot of Mr. Pipes and Mr. Stessel and Alexander Haig and Richard Allen and William Casey and Ronald Reagan. But they've quieted down a little bit. A lot of the wind is out of their sails, and they're noticeably quieter than they were when they were just fresh and strong and in office. There are a lot of scandals going on. The Italian scandal that I've talked about for the last 3 weeks is horrendous, and it's kind of at a standstill. I'm just sitting home chuckling and laughing, knowing what they know and knowing how nervous they must be. I wouldn't want to be in their place. I sincerely believe that the Italians aren't going to let it wash away. They've had enough. They're impoverished. They have reason to be angry about what's been coming down in their country, and they're sitting on it. And it's an interesting case that I thought maybe I'd just update some of the news this week and get back to Mr. Sindone and the Italian scandal next week, because it's going to take a long time for that to unravel, and we don't want to get too behind in other articles. But when you talk about the bad news of the assassination attempt on Mrs. Gandhi, or the killing of the president of Bangladesh and the president of Ecuador, and the assassination this week on the Marcos assassination attempt that was stopped, there's a lot of bad news, but there is good news. There is another counterforce holding all of this evil that has transpired that I've studied for years, and I feel very confident that the powers that be are holding them at bay. People like Michael Hand have not been discovered, and if they were dead, they would be glad to announce it. The partner of Frank Nugent from that bank in Australia, the CIA bank, and the money at the Wells Fargo has not been accounted for. There's hundreds and hundreds of millions. I added up 22 billion in just 2 or 3 hours the dates and times when that was missing. And the bankers must be very nervous, and the people eventually will respond, as they are doing in Italy, to a lot of dirty work that they've known has been going on for a long time, but at some point they're going to say, we've had enough. Mr. Sindona took about $235 million out of the Vatican funds. He took money out of Luxembourg, Liechtenstein banks, Swiss banks, Milan banks, the Franklin National Bank. In New York City, Mr. Ajah shot the Pope. He didn't shoot him anywhere but in Rome, Italy, and that wasn't really very smart. The Rome Italian police have him, and no doubt he must be talking, and the more he talks, the more complicated this gets, and it will bring a noose around Alexander Haig and NATO, and I believe Ronald Reagan and many officials in government today. Time magazine this last week had an article on the Italian scandal, and they're beginning to recognize it is indeed a scandal. This is the 4th week. They said for 17 days they've been trying to resolve the latest crisis, but the Italian people have settled in for a prolonged period of political paralysis. And you can say that again. This is a long period of political paralysis because of the Italian scandal. They are investigating charges such as espionage, tax fraud, illegal currency dealings, and planning to undermine the state. They always list everything but murder, but they know that this gang have already been suspected of many, many murders and have been linked to those murders through the media and courts for a long, long time. They went on to say that the selection of a new cabinet will shed full light on the P2 affair, that's the Italian scandal, and they will take all necessary measures needed to dissolve the secret lodge, the center of pollution of national life, secret, perverse, and corrupting influences. Well, if they are going to get rid of the center of the pollution of their life, then they have to go to the CIA in the United States and the Republican Party in the United States and Michael Sindona and the people that put Richard Nixon into office and Ronald Reagan also, because we never finished wiping up that pollution. Time magazine said, whatever the outcome, the new mandate in Italy will guarantee that the crisis is going to drag on as repercussions from the Masonic affair shake the nation's establishment. Now, they're talking about Italy, but it's going to come across to the United States and into Spain and into South America to Argentina and to Otto Skorzeny and Nazi funds and secret powers to overthrow governments and kill people. And Time magazine has settled back and is resigned to the fact that this is going to be a long affair. They are not making a lot of the connections, but they realize how long it's going to be. They said until now the arrest warrants have only been for 2 people. Grand Master Licio Gelli, who I mentioned last week was at Reagan's inauguration and was active with the Republican Party. He's believed to be in Uruguay, and Colonel Viezer, the former head of the Government Intelligence Service, which would be the equivalent of our CIA. And there's little doubt that other arrests will go on. Now they begin talking about the deaths, and they talk about one fellow who was shot and killed. Mr. Rossi, the Treasury Police, shot and killed himself. This is June the 5th, last week. He's the first death that Time magazine talks about in relationship to this case since it began to unfold in the past 3 weeks. They talk about Mr. Rossi, who shot himself, and then they say the next day another official, Mr. Stamati, was put in the hospital under assumed name in Milan, and he had a heart attack. There was another story that he tried to commit suicide. If you had a magnifying glass or good eyes, one of the listeners to this radio program sent me a one-sentence article in the San Francisco Examiner this week that Mr. Alessandro Canesi, 84, an Italian financier on trial for illegally transferring funds abroad, yesterday in Milan. The article was so short they didn't even say he died. He just yesterdayed in Milan. He was involved with that $2 billion Saudi Arabian oil tax money that was sent to Argentina. Italy is impoverished, and the money that should be going to the people is going out of the country. So there are 3 deaths in the last week. And just as Watergate came down, and I did a story on Watergate for Globe magazine, about a year and a half afterwards. It was the 30 deaths immediately after Watergate, within a year of Watergate, of primary witnesses to the Watergate Hotel entry and to the Republican Party, not counting the 30 was like just Dorothy Hunt on the plane crash. I didn't count the other 45 with her. But primary witnesses that had to be murdered, Murray Chotiner and Beverly Kay in the White House that typed up the missing 18-minute on the tape, or the part that was later erased. And I've mentioned those on programs before. So just in the last week, 3 people, one killed himself, one tried to kill himself, and one was a witness to a trial and died. And Time again says Rome magistrates have advised 260 officials on their list that they are being investigated, 15 of Italy's top generals and admirals. Well, Time magazine is a little cautious on that. Last week it was 47 generals and 77 admirals whose security clearances were removed who worked in NATO with Alexander Haig in this secret team and government. And then they went on, if all of the officials linked to the P2 are suspended from the government, there will be 2 cabinet ministers, 3 undersecretaries, 136 members of the armed forces, police, 54 high civil servants will be forced to take a holiday. And they concluded the authorities are moving slowly to establish a firm legal footing from which to deal with the ramifications of the Masonic affair. The political consequences are just beginning to be felt. So while we've been talking on the radio on this program for 3 weeks, starting with the day that the story broke on how important it was, Time magazine as a sounding board is telling you it's going on, it's going to be important, there's going to be a lot of people, a lot of charges, and it will take a long time to relate it directly to Washington, D.C., but when one part falls down, it will have to fall down. Now, that scandal and the shooting of the president and the Pope and these various other things reminds me of, sometimes I have to go to Robinson Jeffers or some of my favorite poets to describe the situations that I'm reading in the newspaper. We'll get back to the news in a minute. I'll just read one poem by Jeffers called Be Angry at the Sun. He said that public men publish falsehoods is nothing new, that America must accept, like the historical republics, corruption and empire has been known for years. Beware of people like that. They are all bound on the wheel. These people, those warriors, observe them just gesticulating, hard word, isn't it? Observe them going down. The gang serves lies. The passionate man plays his part. The cold passion for truth hunts in no pack. From Dante's feet, you are far, but even farther from his dirty political hatreds. Stay away from them. Let boys want pleasure, and men struggle for power, and women perhaps for fame, and the servile to serve a leader, and the dupes to be duped. But yours is not theirs. Just stay out of it and watch them fall. He says, we have seen the human race capture all its dreams except peace. We have watched mankind like Christ toil up and up to be hanged at the top. That's Robinson Jeffers warning you to stay away from these kind of people. These are the falling years. They will go deep. Never weep, never weep. With clear eyes, explore the pit. Watch the great people fall with religious awe. It is not Europe alone that is falling into blood and fire. Decline and fall have been dancing in men's souls for a long time. Sometimes at the last gasp comes peace to every soul. Never to mine until I find out and speak the things that I know. Robinson Jeffers was a very political person and a decent person, and he had a lot of views on war and hatred of people towards each other and the stupidity of it, and the way they climbed to the top and then fall down. And he warned you, stay away from it and keep your children from it and don't have any part of it, and then you won't have to suffer the falling from disgrace. Just a few more words of his from a poem, Shine, Perishing Republic. While this America settles in the mold of its vulgarity, heavily thickening to empire, and protest is only a bubble in the molten mass, it pops and sighs out, and that mass hardens. But for my children, I have them keep their distance from the thickening center of corruption, because corruption has never been compulsory, And when the cities lie at the monster's feet, there are left the mountains. And boys, be in nothing so moderate as in love of man, a clever servant, insufferable master. There is a trap that catches spirits, that catches them. Be careful, it even caught God when he walked on earth. I like Robinson Jeffers, and as you study the daily newspaper of the ways that the government wants to trap us with new laws about internment camps and turning military bases into prisons and new wiretappings and new means of repression, I really don't think it'll work. I think they may try it, they may declare an emergency, but they have too many things on their mind, and I see the system getting unglued. I really do. Last week I talked about the article in the newspaper about Mohammed Ajay and the Pope's alleged assailant reportedly trained at a Palestinian camp. There was an article about being in Damascus, Syria, and location of the PLO where he possibly was trained to kill the Pope. And I said it doesn't mean that it wasn't a CIA base and that there are many CIA bases in Syria and in Lebanon, and that the places where these assassins go or would-be assassins go are every bit as part of the CIA establishment as they are of any leftist group or what they want us to think is leftist. Well, the very next morning, the New York Times ran a large article. They're having a two-part series, The Gaddafi Connections, the CIA Links to Terrorists. I'll do more on that and maybe update one whole evening on the Gaddafi connections of the CIA. But a gentleman that worked with Frank Turple and Edwin Wilson and George Corcola, and I've talked about them many, many times, is talking now and revealing his role. His name is Kevin P. Mulcahy, M-U-L-C-A-H-Y. I never knew that name until Seymour Hersh of the New York Times had an article about him. But now he's telling about the role of the CIA with Wilson and Turple, with the PLO, the Red Brigades of Italy, the Red Army of Japan, the Baader-Meinhof in Germany, the Irish Republic Army, and I've talked about that in the evening before this story broke, and the role of the CIA and Carlos the Jackal from Venezuela, and the CIA money that and the weapons that went into Turple, Corcola, and what we think is the left terrorist group that the Soviet Union is arming is actually armed to the teeth by people from the United States and living in England and Monte Carlo who are supplying them with weapons, with germ warfare, with rockets to launch. And every time they do something, we say they're Russian trained. And now the stories are beginning to break also that these are not leftist terrorists, but are trained by the CIA. There was another article about the Ku Klux Klan that somebody sent to me from the San Francisco Examiner, the Klan resurging on army bases in Germany. Imagine the United States having army bases in Germany where United States soldiers were giving two black people some strychnine poisoning that sent them to the hospital. They had cramps and dizzy spells. Their poison was administered in their coffee because they were black, serving the United States Armed Forces in Germany, where two white armed forces people in Germany are members of the United States Army and the Ku Klux Klan and are giving strychnine in the coffee, similar to the way the CIA was testing arsenic in food in the Middle East. This, of course, could be stopped in 1 minute if the government wanted it to, but it goes on and on. There was another article similar to the one I mentioned last week, the Italian Scandals Reagan link. This was from, again, the People's World, another article linking Ronald Reagan and his links to Mr. Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of the Klan, coming to the inauguration. And the article says that with this Masonic Lodge story breaking, we're getting suicides, resignations, mounting criminal indictments, and it stretches closer and closer to the White House. So there are articles in the United States beginning to say the Italian Scandals Reagan link, and the very first moment they were looking for Mr. Gelli 3 weeks ago, I immediately could put pieces together and think that this may be a Reagan gate, and actually what we should have in this country is 200 or 300 people be forced to resign and open it up the way the Italian people are going to do, and whether we want to or not, we may be forced to do that. Interesting resignation of Justice Potter Stewart of the Supreme Court. I know Ronald Reagan has been dying to make appointments. This is a very important strategic move on his part. Mr. Stewart is not sick. I remember when Richard Nixon became president, he had a quick choice. I think Mr. Goldberg resigned, and when Lyndon Johnson was on, Abe Fortas resigned. They seem to get their liberal cronies to get out so the more conservative can get on. It'll be interesting to see who Ronald Reagan appoints, but I'm wondering, because of the Republican Party being close to that Mr. His name is Guarino, the director of the Republican National Committee, with Mr. Lucio Gelli. I'm wondering if Justice Potter or any other Republicans in Washington, D.C. had other connections, and the sudden resignation of this person has any links to the Italian scandals. There's people in public office who resign or who die of these, what we call apparent heart attacks suddenly, or accidents, and you think they have no link to the news that is coming down that is scandalous, and then weeks or months or years later, you see that there was a direct link. If it wasn't obvious at the time, there sometimes is a link, and it didn't seem... It seems strange that Stewart waited, and he wanted the election to be over, and all of a sudden he says, I'm leaving, my time's up, and I'm going out. So it'll be interesting to see who Ronald Reagan puts in his place. We haven't updated the Wells Fargo story. It's in limbo. I want to do a lot more on that. Ross Fields, that's Harold Smith, was sentenced this week to go to jail for a few weekends. He's to serve 40 consecutive weekends because he used a false name on a passport. Now, that's the fellow that the Wells Fargo tried to charge with $21 million missing from the bank. He hasn't been arrested on those charges. They got him on some minor charges. He still maintains that the bank employees used his account to siphon money through, that he was just a front for that. And if they really were missing $21 million, and he says it's $200 to $300 million, they would at least charge for the $21 million. They've had enough time now, 6 months or so. I did a lot in December on the Wells Fargo scandal, but they're not charging with that. So it's interesting that they've pinned the loss of all this money on this particular man, and he's going to jail on weekends because he used a false name. This last week there was a fire in San Francisco in the Tishman building, and the evening news showed the building burning, the 14th floor in San Francisco, and only one news story bothered to mention that the fire was the records research room of the Wells Fargo Bank. The Los Angeles Times didn't carry a story, but they've had many stories on Harold Smith and the Wells Fargo scandal, the missing money and the tangled web, money out of the Hollywood branch that went to Tennessee, the Palisades branch, the Marina branch. That story was just the lids were put on that. But there was a picture in the LA Times, June the 18th, 1981, high-rise fire, smoke billows from the 14th story of the 14th floor of the 38th story of the Tishman building. There's a fire that began in the records research room belonging to the Wells Fargo Bank. So I'm sure when that fire was put out on the 14th floor, that somehow or other the records of where the $200 or $300 million, if it was that, are destroyed, or if there are court cases linking into it. They probably couldn't deep six it or sneak it out, but very conveniently the records research room of the headquarters of the Wells Fargo Hotel had a little fire in the middle of the high-rise, but that's over now. Don't worry, and the records just got burnt, okay? There's a trial that'll be beginning this week in New York. It won't be long. It'll probably be a 30-minute trial for Mark David Chapman. He's pleading guilty to the shooting of John Lennon because God told him to. His psychiatrist was Bernard Diamond. He was flown in from California as one of the psychiatrists. He's the man who hypnotized Sirhan to tell him how he killed Robert Kennedy when Sirhan didn't put the fatal bullets in Robert Kennedy. So I'm sure that Bernard Diamond must have expertise in telling Chapman, you know, how he had this vision of God and not the CIA and not at Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, or not in Beirut, Lebanon, or not the training in DeKalb County to be a marksman, or the trip around the world with his various cronies and his money and his art collections, and his visit the Sheraton Hotel and the $2,000 in his pocket. God, I guess, did all that too. He's a very religious man. He's a Jesus freak, so I guess God gave him a lot of trips, and God has told him, plead guilty. And if he pleads guilty, then there's no trial, and there wouldn't be much of a trial anyway. So John Lennon is dead and gone, and Mr. Smart Aleck, attorney for Chapman, Mr. Mark, said, I talked to Chapman a lot, and I've never been there when God has been there. Well, that's a dumb remark for an attorney. Tom Davis from Aptos, California, did an interview with me. We may get out an interview or a newsletter once a week. He has a 5-page summary or interview on the John Lennon killing, and it's, if you want it, Right to Research, P.O. Box 1107, Aptos, California 95003, and send $1, and you'll get 5-page summary of the John Lennon question and answers about the Lennon assassination and Mark David Chapman. And I think we'll keep this up from time to time and get some more material into print. From Santa Barbara, from a listener, I got a legal notice, a tiny thing from the Santa Barbara News, and I thought I would share it with you. As I say, this Italian scandal will go on for a long time. The Hinckley trial is going to begin for a year. The Reagan shooting, and there's a lot of news to update and some things that you may not be getting in your newspaper that I want to share with you this evening, just to slow down the pace a little bit. This is from the Santa Barbara News Review, a legal notice. This is public notice. This is to certify that an agency of the United States intelligence community is conducting a long-term experimental domestic agent development program targeting an American citizen. This citizen, herein called the subject, shall be identified by his Social Security number, which is 554-60-1935. The nature of the program is described in the May 1928-29 and June 1st and 2nd, 1981 Los Angeles Daily Journal public notice. In summary, the subject appears to have an unusual skill useful to the agency, the CIA. In 1976, the subject was formally asked to join the agency. The subject declined. The agency persisted in its recruitment activities and has resorted to illegal tactics to motivate the subject. This motivation has gradually increased over the last 5 years. Of particular interest to the subject are statements by individuals who claim agency affiliation and offer stern warnings to the subject if his failure to join the CIA. And in early August of 1980, this is last summer, it was clearly stated that despite his excellent standing in the community, the subject may be framed or events staged or precipitated which would result in the subject's incarceration on criminal charges. In jail, the subject would be the mercy of the government intelligence bureaucracy. If this extreme situation should occur, the subject would be used as a contract agent with informal ties to the agency. The subject's choice would be to follow directions and work or stay in jail. That was dated June the 4th, 1981, and he's protected himself and forewarned with the Social Security number. Now that is pretty sad. It reminds me of Mark David Chapman, who went from Hawaii to Georgia and then went to New York and was evidently programmed to kill John Lennon and didn't want to do it, and went back to Hawaii and then did go to New York with several $1,000s and succeeded in killing John Lennon. But the original story was that Chapman was arrested earlier in Florida, years earlier, on some charges, the first computer printouts, and there was an article he had fled Tennessee. So it could have been that there were early arrest charges on him, and they used him as a program subject, saying, if you don't follow through, we need you. We trained you as a Jesus freak, a Lennon fan. You've listened to the cassettes, the music. We've trained you. We've taken you around the world to the Beatles concert. And we need you and your training and your motivation. And if you don't follow through, we'll put you in jail on the other charges, and then we can experiment on you there and make you be there. Or we need you to put you in a location where you would be obviously entrapped and take the rap for somebody else. Now, there are many people that believe there was a second gunman and extra shots when John Lennon was shot at the Dakota Hotel in New York City. But this is an interesting item that was sent from Santa Barbara News and Review, and it is indicative that a person is afraid of the possibilities and is fully aware of the way the agency operates. This is the end of 30 minutes. We'll take a 1-minute break and then come back.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Come on down, we need you. Join.
When the scandal of Harold Smith and the Wells Fargo bank story broke, and the scandal of the Nugan Hand, the Australian CIA bank story broke with its interconnecting links to various countries and agencies, I said at the time that I believed that if these two were put together and the money traced, it would tie into the funding of the Manson family in California, the forming of the SLA that was put together by the CIA and the Special Forces, Colston Westbrook of the Special Forces, who was in Southeast Asia and experimenting in mind control and coming down as part of the COINTEL program, and even into the Jonestown operation. But specifically, I was thinking of the Manson family and the SLA. Now, those two major stories are totally not solved, and they're not unrelated to Mr. Licio Gelli and the Italian scandal with its links to the United States into Argentina and South America. So it was very interesting this last week, June the 6th, to see that Sheriff Peter Pitchess is retiring from Los Angeles. He was the man in Los Angeles County, the sheriff who was behind these various operations along with Ed Davis of the Los Angeles Police Department. These were the United States so-called leftist terrorists, similar to Carlos the Jackal, floating around Europe and in the Middle East, acting as if he was a Russian terrorist or leftist terrorist. Peter Pitchess did have a heart surgery, a bypass surgery. I hope he didn't retire to get an appointment such as on the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan. The one appointment I want to watch is Evil Younger. If he tries to pull an Evil Younger appointment, because Evil Younger helped him make decisions to get his cabinet together, and he's sitting out in the wings. He's a retired general. He was in the CIA, the FBI, the district attorney in Los Angeles when Sirhan was charged with killing Robert Kennedy, and Thane Caesar was allowed to be free to work with his Nazi organizations, and then he was the attorney general in California. What I'm really afraid about, the retirement on the Supreme Court now, is Evil Younger being plucked in by Ronald Reagan. That is one that you'll have to go to your library and get all your information or your past tapes that you have from me and begin to write letters, because if Reagan tries to pull that, you are in trouble nationally, just as we were in California with various counterintelligence violences that were taking place in California. There's arrest of some policemen, long police force establishment people in the Los Angeles area just this week who were going to the Vegas area to do weekend robberies to get $10,000 a week for the pocket money because they said they were tired of being nobody. But the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department, which really got it down pat, of the San Francisco Police Department with the zebra killings and the Zodiac and so forth, they have a counterintelligence operation going which keeps people in disarray and random murders and what they call those senseless murders, the LA Stranglers, and the different kinds of operations that I've run down many times. And it's worked in California beautifully to make these prosecuting attorneys and the defense attorneys and the district attorneys all superstars, writing books, getting in the news media, and making a lot of hay and money out of it while giving the illusion that crime is rampant everywhere. There is a lot of crime, but a lot of it is manipulated. And Peter Pitchess is resigning. I'd like to think he's resigning because of Michael Hand talking or interconnecting links, just as at the time of Watergate, people had to resign. They had to become former people so they wouldn't be linked to the scandal. When Frank Sinatra wanted to be in charge of Caesar's Palace, it was the Sheriff Peter Pitchess who testified on his behalf that Sinatra isn't part of the mob. He said, if Sinatra's a member of the mafia, then I'm the godfather. And I mentioned once before that's the truth, and that's part of the game in California. But these people work very closely together, and I just hope they don't move on to national level. I hope the scandals that are not surfacing beyond just a certain point at this time will force them to retrench and pull back and become a little more modest and quiet, where they were aggressive the first couple of months of Reagan's administration. In a few weeks, I want to continue with all these little mini revolutionary people that are being picked up in Houston, Texas, and at the airports, and do an in-depth story of the Dominica, the hauling of the invasion of the island of Dominica. I mentioned it, just briefly on a couple of programs, but I haven't gone in depth to it. The interesting thing is that the men who were arrested have the name John Connally in their pocket, and there were tape recordings referring to John Connally. And the first story said, it's not the John Connally, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of the Navy, the John Connally from the cabinets, the Texas governor. But yes, it was that John Connally, and there were tape recordings of John Connally's name. And some of the men arrested in New Orleans that worked with this Dominica invasion that had the Nazi flags, that said they worked for the CIA, that used retired policemen from Kansas and Oklahoma, the heads of the Klan in various states, Canadian people, lots of money. They had on tape recordings names of Texas Governor John Connally, U.S. Representative Ron Paul, Republican from Texas, and a U.S. district judge was subpoenaed to go to New Orleans to testify about this case because his name was also there. But he had an excuse. It would take too much time from work, and it would cost federal tax dollars and waste on his travel to go to New Orleans. Well, the subpoena was quashed, so the three men don't have to go there, but the fact remains, according to the Houston Post, that Connally's name was used in undercover tapes that the federal government has. And if Connally is linked to that Dominica invasion, it wouldn't surprise me, because I only had one source or heard it on the radio or TV, that it was for Robert Vesco, and that would synchronize with Vesco's being kicked out of the Bahamas. So Vesco and Connally have worked close enough. I mentioned before Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney for Vesco, and John Connally is the attorney for John Hinckley Jr., and John Hinckley Jr.'s little Nazi buddies, and Connally is deeply involved with Nazi and Klan and the very far right in this country, the farthest right. So it doesn't surprise me that this goon squad from Canada, the United States, with lots of money, was going down that island. They said they were supposed to invade Grenada also and overthrow that government, and they were going to get a fee to overthrow that government. But it's interesting that the judge doesn't have the courage to force Governor Connally, John Connally, the former Texas governor, or a member of the Congress, Ron Paul from Texas, to go down to that trial. The defendant claims, one of the defendants insists, that these people that I named were friends of his, that they knew of the coup attempt. The defense lawyers say that Mr. Perdue, their client, worked with these people, that they didn't plan an illegal bloodbath, that they were going to act as military advisors to the government with the approval of the United States government, that landing was approved by the government. It was a CIA operation. It had the highest level of approval of the United States government, and yet our government was using the Klan, the Nazi Party, Nazi flags, and you're going to hear more about the word Nazi for a long, long time. I remember several years ago on KLRB, I was using it so much, and a lot of people just shook their head. They couldn't understand the relationship between the word Nazi and a lot of the news that was coming out, and it was everywhere in the research that I was doing. But when you get an assassination attempt on the president and the young American is linked to Nazis in 4 or 5 different states in the United States, and an assassination attempt on the Pope with a man who's linked to Nazi organizations in 8 or 9 different countries, and you get Mr. Gelli with links to Franco, Hitler, Mussolini, Perón, and the Nazi Party ever since World War II, since Franco's days, you get 3 major stories that all have interconnecting links to not neo-Nazis, but Nazis, and then the young ones growing up tutored by the others. But it is something that you're not going to be able to avoid, and the sooner you face the reality of the strength with which the Nazis have taken over or entrenched this country, then you're going to come to the solutions. There's a new book out on that subject, and I'll be doing quite a few broadcasts on it. It's called The Secrets of the SS by Glenn Infield. Now, if you want some samples of the book, if it hasn't come out yet, I imagine it'll be out pretty soon by Stein and Day. The Gallery magazine this month has a story, America's Secret Alliance with the Nazi SS. And he goes into quite a few points. Some of them I disagree with, and I'll illustrate the differences, but quite a few of them I agree with Mr. Infield. And I think that these books are long overdue, the connecting links of the Nazis to not only Americans putting Hitler into power, but to the continuation of them and how they're affecting our lives today. That is the important thing, and that's why I kept talking about them, not because I'm whipping a dead horse that was long ago buried and doesn't affect us. This Mr. Infield, who has written this book on the SS, also wrote that book, Hitler's Secret Life, which is one of my favorite books on Hitler and the Hitler era, and many episodes that are interesting. And in this new book on the SS, he talks about the brotherhood, the SS brotherhood of Hitler and the Third Reich around the world. And he said more than 3 decades after the end of the Third Reich, 3 decades after, the SS, that's the Secret Service brotherhood of Hitler, around the world are using Hitler's principles that they learned from Hitler. They are bombing, they are kidnapping, they use poison gas, physical torture, all are standard operating procedures for today's terrorists. And they were taught to them in many cases by the former Third Reich SS members. A special commission has now been assigned and established to identify them in the United States. Now, I have said on these broadcasts for a long time that we hear about bombings, we hear about kidnappings, poison gas, physical torture, and we try to say, or Gene Kirkpatrick tries to say for Ronald Reagan, or Reagan says, or Haig says, the Russians are terrorists, the Russians are spreading terror around the world. There's books out on the terrorism of Russia. And Mr. Infield, who's an expert on Adolf Hitler, who has studied him extensively, written 10 books, is saying that the bombings today, the kidnappings, the poison gas, the physical torture are procedures done specifically by men who were part of Hitler's secret service, the SS. And he says, we are now looking into this material, and we have ignored, the United States has ignored the background of these secret men, the SS organizations, and they've used cover names, and they're involved in political and military affairs, and they are the cause of the upsurge of neo-Nazism around the globe. Now, many people think that neo-Nazism or Nazism, because it was continuous, it isn't neo-pneumonia if you get something in your lungs, or it isn't neo-polio, it's polio like it was polio before. It's the same Nazis, and I hate to use the word neo because it looks like the others died and these are the offshoots, and it isn't that way at all. The problem with Nazism around the world in Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, Middle East, various countries, and is wherever you see Nazism, or in the United States with the Nazi organizations, doesn't come from inflation. It doesn't come because the blacks did something wrong. It doesn't come because of social situations of unemployment or poor housing. It comes because those people in Germany that caused the social situations that allowed people to get more crazy and more cruel were invited to this country and given high jobs and positions, and brought with them not only the racism and the prejudices we had before World War II began, but they brought the methods of killing, the methods of torture, the methods of mind control, the methods of medical experiments. And we brought them to UCLA, and we brought them to Stanford Research, and into the space programs, and to Vacaville, and to the prisons, and to the universities, and into the engineering fields, and the scientists, you name it, the psychiatrists. We brought them over in a boatload. Now, Mr. Infield's book talks about after World War II was over, the Brown Building is where the SS had their headquarters and their list of Nazi members in the elite guard of the SS. And the Americans went into these offices and procured them, so it should have been an easy matter to pinpoint who they were and to prosecute them. But would you believe that when they got into the offices, there were over 4 million members of the secret SS, or many, many people, more than 1 million of the hardcore. There weren't prisons enough for them. There were 4 million people in the American zone. They cut Germany into 4 sections, and like a piece of pie to reconstruct after the Nazi era. And they had the list of people and questionnaires to each survivor. There were 13 million Germans that survived, and they were going to denazify the country of one particular group of the most hated organization called the SS. It was so horrendous that that was the one group that they were going to denazify, and sent brochures and had the names of the members. And in the American zone alone, in the 4th piece of that pie, there were 4 million people that would have required trials. 4 million people. They couldn't do that. So the American Army, 1 year later, in June of 1946, said to the German government, take them. We don't want the jails. They'll hang a few at Nuremberg. Give us a handful of them, and we'll keep heads in prison. You take them. We can't handle it. You denazify them. And the people they put in charge of denazifying them were also members of the SS. One of the subscribers to these tapes I've known for many, many years in New York sent me a book called The Brown Book. Maybe you can obtain it. It's hard to get, and it's a jewel of a book with where the members of the SS went, and the secret team in Germany. They became the ambassadors to Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, John and Johannesburg, the African countries, in Taiwan, Shanghai, Singapore, United States. They all got key positions. They were never denazified. And there's no mystery about how things are coming down today. It's been obvious to me for about 18 years, but a lot of people have to hurt more before they begin to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And there are a lot of people putting the pieces of the puzzle together. So if you want a preview of the book, get Gallery Magazine this month. And if you want to wait and get the book, you can get the book. I want to support the magazine because they went to the trouble of printing this section, and I really do appreciate it. One section in the book, as I said, mentions, Mr. Infield says, that in many other countries outside of the United States, outside of Germany rather, the secret SS organizations used cover names and were involved in political and military affairs, which added to the resurgence of Nazism around the globe. And they had covers. Well, I've mentioned earlier on programs the book Wanted, Search for the Nazis, and a perfect example of a cover was Richard Nixon's office. They brought Nicolae Mlaksa from the Iron Guard, from Romania, and his experience with the OSS and concentration camps, into the office of Richard Nixon in Whittier, California, through Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, and the Undersecretary of State Adolph Burl, who helped Richard Nixon prosecute Alger Hiss. And they brought Mlaksa to Nixon's office, and Nixon introduced a private bill in 1951 to make Mlaksa become a permanent member of the United States, a citizen. And the basis was that he had a company called Western Tube, and that was a very valuable company for making tubes for oil refinery that we needed in the Korean War. Now, it turned out he didn't make anything at all. It wasn't a thing at all. Western Tube was simply an address at the Bank of America building in the law offices of Richard Nixon. And Western Tube was a dummy front, one of many dummy fronts of the notorious SS. And after he opened up his office there, then he went down to Argentina, to Juan Perón, where Mr. Licio Gelli from Rome, Italy, was down in Argentina with Perón. And Nicolae Mlaksa was meeting in Buenos Aires and in Madrid with Otto Skorzeny and all the top Nazis, and having a ball and setting up a Nazi network in every country around the world that they could do it in. So the entree to Skorzeny and his old buddies from the SS was to go through Richard Nixon's office and set up a front, pretend that he was useful to the war effort, and then continue the Nazification of the world. So people like Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and the SS and Licio Gelli and Nicolae Mlaksa and Otto Skorzeny, and you'll hear that name a lot because of a new book coming out about Skorzeny and the Gelli Fair in Italy, Licio Gelli, and the future arrest of him, or the expose that will come out. This gang had friends, and they had friends in a man who was defeating Helen Douglas, calling her a red when he ran for the Senate, kicked out Jerry Voorhees in the House of Representatives, who was a good guy, worked in Long Island, bringing Nazis to the country, was vice president 8 years. Richard Nixon not only worked with organized crime and Bibi Reboza and Alvin App and all the mafia drug dealers, and was thick with them, but the most important story, it was the first story I ever published when Watergate wrote on how Nixon really came to power. And I wrote that before Howard Bloom wrote Wanted Search for the Nazis. I think I was the first published person in the United States to link Richard Nixon to the importation of Nazis in the United States. And then Howard Bloom, who writes for the New York Times, he went one step further and put them right with Bank of America and dummy fronts, and down there was Scorzeni and Juan Perón. So when I say the Italian scandal is going to bring down and interconnect a lot of people, my research has them weaving in and out together in interesting patterns. Gallery also, in this section of the book of Infield, has a description of the Army, the Counterintelligence Corps, the 66th CIC, that wanted Scorzeni released, and they helped him get out of the prison so he could make his resurgence of the Nazi Party. And he described that it was rumored among the counterintelligence group that Scorzeni had been useful in helping Hitler escape. Now, Infield has a contradiction in his other book on Adolf Hitler and in this book on the Nazis, too. He writes in sections of the book that Hitler died in the bunker, and then he always brings up subjects that he's not sure Hitler is dead. At least he's fair that he brings it out. So in his new book on the SS, he brings out again that there was much talk that Scorzeni was instrumental and useful in bringing Hitler out of Germany. And then he also said something in this book, quoted in Gallery, that I don't agree with, that one of the excuses to get Scorzeni out was to follow him to find Martin Bormann and other top Nazis. Now, Infield is a good writer, but Infield is wrong. Accept him for what he says, and I'll point out some of the differences and maybe do a 1-hour evening on that, like I did with David Lifton's Best Evidence, do one book review on this subject. But I strongly disagree that Scorzeni was let out to find other Nazis. The Vatican, Montini, Secretary of the Vatican, wrote the passport for Bormann. He knew where he was. He knew he was down with Juan Perón and Gelli and the whole gang down there from Italy. They knew where he was, and Scorzeni was part of this whole operation, and they weren't looking for Bormann. William Casey of the OSS, I mentioned last week, director of our CIA, and now he knew where Gelli was and Scorzeni was and Juan Perón, what he was doing, and the OSS was using these people. They're the ones that assisted Scorzeni in getting out so he could rebuild the Nazis so they would give us that lovely gift of World War III. That's what they want, and that's what they're hell-bent on getting. But in the interim, between the intent of arming for World War III and having it, a lot of people are getting smarter, and a lot of stories are being leaked, and we have satellite communication and instant radio and FM radio and tape cassettes, and I really doubt that people would put their heart and guts into the kind of war that these people dreamed that they could engineer years ago. They thought about space technology, controlling the space stations, you control the world. The Russians just set up 2 machines that linked to begin their first space station. So when you get a system going that has so much intent to control so many people, the same technology that would make it possible to control these people has been the technology of communication, where people can talk with each other and figure out what they are doing. In other words, I don't think we'll be so easily led down the river, and I think these stories and scandals that are breaking now, that are seeping out, are ways of stopping the aggression that they intended, and I think that many of the people that I've been talking about on the air for weeks are very much nervous about their future. As I say, Mr. Walesa in Poland, as soon as Gelli was arrested and fled, I don't know if it was simultaneously or a cause and effect, he said, well, I think I'll resign and go take care of my family and stop the Polish labor problems. Was he funded by the secret fund, and if there's no money in it, he's not going to go further? Time will tell how far he goes or what he'll do, or whether he'll be paid off and come to the United States and get $1 million for a book and live like Solzhenitsyn. I don't know. He may become a Cold Warrior over here stirring up stuff, but he might be ineffectual in Poland if his money is cut off. One more thing in the news before I finish. Omni Magazine has some good articles this month, and there's quite a few, and I want to run them down, and I think you really, if you can, get them. One is on OTRAG, O-T-R-A-G. That's the rocket system that the German government put in Zaire, and the Russians accused them and NASA of using the Peenemünde NASA Nazis for space stations in Africa. It was a $50 million operation that was halted because it was linked to Adolf Hitler's Peenemünde, and now it's been moved where? To Libya with Gaddafi. They have another article, Explorations, an interesting article on Disneyland and how Disneyland is a prototype for future communities. It's an important research center of applied scientists. They're studying technology for feeding, housing, and transporting large numbers of people. Be careful. Remember the tapes I did a while back on Disneyland? The perfect little happy community. It doesn't have a jail, a school, a hospital. It doesn't have anything. It doesn't even have people. It closes down at night. But they're using it as a prototype for moving people. And underground, underneath where these 85,000 people tromp every day, are these mazes of tunnels and rooms where they have warehouses, refrigerating facilities, lounges, wardrobes for 12 to 15,000 people. Be careful. You may see scenes like Coma or Auschwitz or experimentation. This one little happy town is nothing but a dummy front with a railroad that goes into a super Disneyland future hotel down in Florida, that Disneyland. And they're working out how to transport large numbers of people. Very interesting article. It tells about their electronic tiki birds. I've heard them down at Disneyland in California when Mr. Watts kills all wildlife and everything decent as the head of our interior for Reagan. We can get those electronic tiki birds to sing for us. This tells about Disneyland being used by the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy and Transportation, and NASA and technology. They have those electronic presidents. Remember, they're all wired up and say what you want to say. They give us those old speeches out of the archives. Interesting articles. There's 5 articles. I don't have time to run them down for you, but they're very interesting and important in Omni this month, and I'm very interested in that Disneyland. I think we could be sucked into this little Tomorrowland, and it would be the end of the road. I think it's a dangerous operation that I've watched develop for a long time, and I don't think there's going to be that much fun and games. If that's the prototype of the future city, why don't they start applying it in Harlem or Watts or San Francisco or L.A. to some of the slum areas? Let Gerard O'Neill, who designs these beautiful space colonies, tell us why, if he's in Princeton, New Jersey, he can't go to Trenton, New Jersey and make the city look beautiful. He's going to spend billions of dollars to put you on a space colony and tell you it's heaven beyond your wildest imaginations, and he's maybe 20 miles or 30 from the worst poverty in the country and unemployment and dirty, unkempt cities, and he can't figure out what to do with those. So beware of Tomorrowland, and let's concentrate on today. Well, I thought I'd update a few of these stories with you in the news before we get some of that really heavy stuff next week and continue with the Italian scandal. There'll be a lot more, and I have a lot more to share with you. But I did want to share some of these things with you now, and they just pass by so quickly, and they're important articles and books coming out, and you can get them and start reading them and keep up on some of these matters. In the meantime, we'll take another week to study and observe and watch them slide down that ladder. I think they're going to fall. I really do. It's interesting, and just watch how it comes down. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll be back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.